Bradley Welsh was no ordinary man. Born and raised in the gritty streets of Edinburgh, he wasn't just a figure on the corner of the ring or a local personality. He was a force of nature. From the moment he stepped into the boxing ring, it was clear that Welsh wasn't one to be underestimated. He was a natural fighter, a man forged by the rough edges of Edinburgh's underbelly. But his story, a mix of violence, charisma, and dangerous ambition, went far beyond the bright lights of boxing. Growing up, Welsh was shaped by the toughest of environments. His journey began in the chaos of football hooliganism, where he wasn't just part of a crowd, he was a leader in it. His past as a member of the infamous Hibs Casuals wasn't something that would fade easily. It followed him, shaping not only his reputation in the streets, but also cementing connections that would later bind him to the criminal underworld. He knew the rules of the streets, he knew how to survive, and he knew how to turn those connections into power. But Welsh was no ordinary thug. He wasn't merely a man who used fists to gain respect. He was a man who understood the power of charm, of presence, of charisma. He quickly transitioned from the violent world of hooliganism to becoming a symbol of Edinburgh's community. His story, one of redemption and reinvention. People saw him as a local hero, a man who used his tough guy persona to steer kids away from the same dangerous paths he had once walked. He ran a boxing gym, offered guidance, and preached a message of discipline and second chances. But behind the scenes, Welsh was anything but the saint he presented to the public. His rise through the ranks of Edinburgh's criminal elite was just as rapid as his success in the ring. It wasn't just about running a gym or building a reputation as a community man. Welsh had ties to Scotland's most notorious gangsters. He had earned his place in the underworld as a businessman, controlling clubs, drug deals, and networks that stretched deep into Edinburgh's darker corners. His name was whispered in hushed tones, not just as a former boxer, but as someone with the kind of influence that made people think twice before crossing him. To the public, Bradley Welsh was a man who represented Edinburgh. He was a community figure who loved his city and wanted to protect it. He was the guy who, when he wasn't hosting charity events, could be found making underworld deals that most people couldn't even begin to fathom. He knew how to walk between two worlds, one of respect and legitimacy, and the other of fear and ruthless power. In the criminal circles, Welsh wasn't a figure of mere association. He was a kingpin, a man whose word carried weight and whose business ventures were often as shady as they were profitable. But with this rise to power came the inevitable fall. In the cutthroat world of crime, there's always someone looking to take your place. And as Welsh's influence grew, so did the number of enemies he made. The complex web of criminal activity that he was tangled in eventually led him to a crossroads. Welsh was no longer just a man trying to turn his life around. He had become a target, someone whose ambition and success had put a massive bullseye on his back. In the months leading up to his murder, tensions within Edinburgh's underworld were reaching a boiling point. Rivalries between gangs were growing increasingly hostile. Welsh, with all his connections and influence, became the focal point of these rising conflicts. People who had once looked to him for protection and guidance now saw him as a barrier to their own ambitions. The money Welsh controlled, the territory he dominated, these became the stakes that others were willing to fight for, or rather, kill for. One name in particular began to surface amid these tensions: Sean Orman, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness. Orman wasn't just another gangster vying for control. He was a man driven by an insatiable thirst for power, and it seemed Bradley Welsh was standing in his way. Whether it was over money, power, or simply a matter of pride, Orman had become determined to eliminate the obstacle Welsh posed. But for Welsh, his suspicions came too late. The web of betrayal and violence that had been building around him for months finally caught up. The hit was meticulously planned, with chilling precision. Orman, hired to take down Welsh, had been tracking his every move. He knew the route Welsh would take home that night, the exact timing of his arrival, and the vulnerable moment when he would be alone. It was April 17th, 2019, a quiet, calm evening in Edinburgh. For most, it was just another night, but for Bradley Welsh, it was the night everything would change. As he made his way toward his home on Chester Street, there was no sign of the danger lurking just around the corner. Orman had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, it was brutal, cold, and calculated. In a flash, it was over. One shot from a shotgun, fired with deadly precision, ended the life of the man who had once commanded respect on both sides of Edinburgh's streets. Welsh crumpled to the ground, the life draining out of him before he could even react. The sound of the gunshot shattered the peace of the evening, and as quickly as the violence had erupted, Orman disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the lifeless body of Bradley Welsh. The hit wasn't just a murder, it was a message. In the dangerous world Welsh had inhabited, no one was untouchable. The cold efficiency of the hit proved that even the most powerful figures could fall, and fall quickly. The police were soon on the scene, but Ormond had already vanished, slipping into the shadows and leaving the authorities scrambling. Bradley Welsh's death sent shockwaves through Edinburgh, reverberating across the streets and into the criminal underworld. Those who had admired him were stunned, while those who had feared him now knew the harsh reality of what could happen when power and betrayal collided. The legend of Bradley Welsh, the man who had once straddled the line between hero and villain, was now nothing more than a tragic memory. For Ormond, the chase didn't end with the murder. The authorities soon began their pursuit, and Ormond's escape was nothing short of cinematic. He disappeared into the maze of Edinburgh's underworld, using safe houses, switching cars, and relying on a network that spanned far beyond the city's borders. But even the most elusive criminals make mistakes. The police were closing in, and it wasn't long before Ormond's freedom came to a violent end. The high-speed chase that followed Ormond's attempted escape was a dramatic finale to this twisted tale. Behind the wheel of an Audi Q3, Ormond pushed the car to its limits, weaving through traffic in a desperate bid to evade capture. For 21 minutes, the chase played out like something from an action film, fast, furious, and full of tension. But in the end, Ormond's run came to an end. The Audi was cornered, and the man who had brought terror to Edinburgh's streets was finally in police custody. But even as Ormond was captured, the story of Bradley Welsh's life and death was far from over. His murder had been a culmination of months of violence, betrayal, and power struggles. It was the end of an era, and as Ormond was put on trial for the murder, it became clear that Welsh's death was more than just the tragic end of one man. It marked the conclusion of a chapter in Edinburgh's history, a chapter defined by the kind of power, danger, and violence that few could truly understand. In the courtroom, Ormond sat motionless as the prosecution laid bare the details of his involvement. The evidence was overwhelming. CCTV footage, forensic evidence, and witness testimonies all pointed directly to him. Ormond's fate was sealed. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 28 years before he could even be considered for parole. But the sentencing of Sean Ormond didn't bring relief or closure. It left a chilling silence in its wake, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Bradley Welsh had lived fast, he had lived large, and ultimately he had paid the price. His death was a grim reminder of the volatile world he had chosen to inhabit, a world where even the most respected and feared figures could be brought down in an instant. As the city moved on, the void left by Welsh's death was palpable. The man who had lived between two worlds, who had commanded respect from both sides, was gone, and in his absence, Edinburgh's streets were left to reckon with the consequences of a life lived on the edge. The story of Bradley Welsh, a man who had it all and lost it all, is a stark reminder. In the world of crime, power, and betrayal, no one is invincible. Everyone pays the price. Bradley Welsh was a man who moved through life with the kind of raw power that could shake a city to its core. But despite his larger-than-life persona, the undercurrents of his life, the dark forces that circled around him, remained his constant companion. From the gritty streets of Edinburgh to the back rooms of Scotland's criminal underworld, Welsh's influence was far-reaching, and his very existence seemed to be a balancing act between the man the public adored and the shadowy figure who ran in the world of crime. As a former boxer, Welsh was no stranger to battles. He had bled and fought for his reputation inside the ring, but it was outside the ropes, in the rough and tumble world of Edinburgh's toughest streets, that he really earned his name. He was a man who had earned the respect of hooligans and gangsters alike, a symbol of strength and resilience that extended far beyond his physical capabilities. Welsh's rise was fueled by street-smart cunning and sheer charisma, traits that made him beloved by many in his community and feared by those who lurked in the criminal world. But it was the combination of his public-facing heroism and his involvement in the city's murky dealings that made him such a dangerous figure. Welsh's move into community work after boxing could have been a redemption story, but the reality was more complex. While his boxing career had ended, his rise in the criminal underworld was just beginning. His gym, which provided a safe haven for kids, was also a recruitment tool for the darker side of Edinburgh's society. Behind closed doors, Welsh was making connections with the city's criminal elite, aligning himself with players who controlled the underworld, from drug lords to gangsters. He was a businessman running clubs and shady operations. villains, building an empire that blended both respectability and criminality. Yet Welsh never lost his connection to the streets. His public persona was that of a community leader, a tough guy with a big heart who wanted to help others avoid the path he'd walked. This made him a hero in the eyes of many, but to others, those who worked the shadows, he was a man with something to prove, someone willing to use his connections and streetwise reputation to climb even higher. But as anyone involved in the criminal world knows, the higher you rise, the more dangerous the game becomes. By 2019, Bradley Welsh was at the peak of his power, but cracks were starting to appear. Rivalries within Edinburgh's underworld were growing more intense, and Welsh, once a man who could walk between two worlds, was beginning to look like a target. His influence, once seen as a stabilizing force, was now viewed by some as a threat. Some believed that Welsh wasn't just playing the game, he was the one in charge of it. Others resented his rise and wanted a piece of the empire he'd built. Tensions were rising, and as the old saying goes in the world of crime, in this business, there's always someone waiting to take your place. It was during this time of growing animosity that one name started to emerge, a name tied to a growing feud that would shake the very foundation of Edinburgh's criminal world: Sean Orman. Orman was known as a cold and calculated man, willing to go to any lengths to rise to the top. Welsh, for all his power and connections, had now become a symbol of what Orman wanted, a kingpin in his own right. But the difference was that Welsh wasn't just a gangster, he had a foot in the world of legitimacy, a public face that could not be ignored. Orman saw Welsh as both an obstacle and a rival. The hit on Bradley Welsh was not just about killing a man, it was about making a statement. For Welsh, the warning signs had been there, but he was used to operating in dangerous waters. He never thought that the threat would come so directly, so brutally. On April 17th, 2019, Bradley Welsh, walking down the quiet streets of Edinburgh, unaware of the danger lurking, was shot at point-blank range by Sean Orman. The hit was swift, the method coldly professional, a calculated assassination that ended Welsh's life in a flash. The reverberations of his murder were immediate. In the blink of an eye, the man who had been both hero and villain, community leader and criminal mastermind, was gone. The streets of Edinburgh, once ruled by Welsh's iron-fisted power, were now left without their king. But for the criminal world, the killing wasn't just about vengeance. It was a lesson. In the streets, no one is untouchable, no matter how powerful they seem. Orman's role in the killing of Bradley Welsh was more than just that of a hired hitman. He was a reflection of the brutal underworld that had helped shape Welsh's own rise to power. Orman wasn't just a figure in the shadows, he was the embodiment of the betrayals, the rivalries, and the broken alliances that defined the criminal landscape of Edinburgh. And after the murder, Orman did what he did best: he vanished. But the police weren't far behind. Orman, with his mastery of the criminal world's labyrinthine web, managed to stay one step ahead for a while. His escape was like something out of a thriller, a high-speed chase through the streets of Edinburgh, evading the authorities for over 20 minutes, his Audi Q3 weaving through traffic in a desperate attempt to escape. But eventually, the chase ended, and Orman was captured, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. The trial that followed was a spectacle, one that gripped the city. The courtroom was filled with tension as the brutal facts of Welsh's murder were laid bare. Orman, emotionless, sat in the dock as the prosecution painted a damning picture of the hit. His carefully crafted escape, the chilling precision of the execution, the months of buildup, all of it came together in the courtroom. The trial wasn't just about bringing a killer to justice. It was the closing of a chapter in Edinburgh's underworld. The city would never be the same. When the verdict came, it was not just about punishing Orman for his actions. It was about acknowledging the price of the game. Orman was sentenced to life in prison, his future now uncertain. But for many in Edinburgh, the sentence wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the damage that had been done, the lives shattered, and the power vacuum left behind by Welsh's death. Bradley Welsh's murder marked the end of an era. He had lived his life at full throttle, riding the razor's edge between power and danger. He was a man who thrived on the adrenaline of both the criminal world and the public eye. But in the end, the price of living that fast was a sudden, brutal end. His death left a void, a silence that echoed through the streets of Edinburgh. The legend of Bradley Welsh would live on, but his absence was a stark reminder of the brutal nature of the world he had inhabited. In the criminal underworld, no one is safe. Not even the king. This was the life and death of Bradley Welsh, fighter, hero, villain, and ultimately, a man who couldn't outrun the very forces he had once controlled. His story, filled with power, danger, and betrayal, stands as a testament to the high price of living in both worlds, and the ultimate cost of playing the game to the very end.